Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions, and we try between us to work out what's going on. Rob Lawlor, a philosopher here at the Idea Centre, has been involved in an interdisciplinary collaboration looking at one possible response to climate change, which is the rationing of carbon emissions. With Nathan Wood and Josie Freer, he's been looking at the history of rationing as well as the ethics. So not just whether rationing would be morally permissible, but also how it might be received by the public. And what we can learn about this from public attitudes to rationing of food during and after the Second World War. When it was first published, the paper got an unusual amount of attention in the media for an academic paper, including lots of positive coverage, but also some disparagement from the likes of Nigel Farage and Richard Littlejohn. As well as discussing the content of the paper, we talked about what that reaction's been like, and I gave Rob a chance to respond to some of the ways the paper has been discussed in the media. Rob, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Hi.
We're here to talk about a paper which you published recently, which is called Rationing and Climate Change Mitigation. Now, this paper, it's worth saying straight off, is not a paper that you wrote on your own. It's one that you produced in collaboration with two other writers, Nathan Wood and Josie Freer. And it's one of the things that's interesting about this paper, before we get into the specific content of it, is how interdisciplinary it was. So you all kind of contributed different elements to this research, right? So could you tell me a bit about how that worked?
Yeah, so my background is entirely in philosophy. Nathan has a bit of a philosophy background in that he did his PhD with us at Idea, but before coming to us to do his PhD, he didn't have any philosophy background. His background was in sustainability and policy related to sustainability. So he did a lot of the work on the policy side of the paper, where we talk about rationing in comparison with other available policies or other policies that have been discussed. And then Josie Freer's background is in history, so she did most of the historical kind of research, including some original archival research, actually looking at kind of what was actually written in reports in the Second World War. And as well as those disciplines, there's also a little bit of economics in it. We don't have a dedicated economist on the team, but me and Josie kind of primarily worked on that kind of economics aspect, particularly given that quite a lot of it is the history of economics.
Right, okay. We'll get a bit into that historical perspective later on, I think, because that's an interesting element of the research. But first of all, let's just introduce what this paper's about. So the problem that we're trying to address here is climate change, which is obviously a big problem, which everybody's going to be aware of. So for the purposes of this discussion, we're assuming that you do agree that climate change is a significant problem, and specifically man-made climate change is a significant problem, and that what we need to do to address that problem, put simply, is to reduce the amount of carbon that we produce as a species. And that's an urgent problem that needs to be addressed. And the solution to that problem that you're suggesting is carbon rationing. So I wondered if you could tell me, first of all, what do you mean by carbon rationing?
Actually, so that's a useful clarification, actually. So it's debatable whether it should be considered carbon rationing. So I think carbon rationing, so we actually consider two responses or two possible versions of rationing in the paper, and probably only one of them would be accurately described as carbon rationing. So that would be the idea that you have a kind of all-encompassing a carbon debit card, where you have a cash card and you pay with things. So you have a carbon allowance, and anytime you buy something, you pay cash for it, but you also pay for it with your carbon allowance. And then if you run out of money, you can't buy anything. But equally, even if you've got money, if you run out of your carbon allowance, you can't buy anything. But that's actually only one of the options we consider. We also talk about just more straightforward of rationing, where you might just ration petrol, for example. So you don't have an all-encompassing carbon ration, but you might think, well, let's focus on particular things. We want people to fly less, so let's ration flights. Yeah. We want people to drive less, so let's ration petrol. We want people to eat less meat, so let's ration meat. So they're kind of two alternatives which both could be considered rationing, both could be considered kind of responses to climate change.
Okay, so you'd have this carbon allowance, and every time you contributed to the production of carbon in one way or another, your carbon allowance would be commensurately reduced. Is that the idea?
So it would be basically at the point of purchase. So it wouldn't be. So I guess it would be looking at how much carbon you produce, but in an indirect way.
In an indirect way,
yeah. So
but it'd include things like how you heat your home, for example.
Probably. I mean, as I say, it depends on which of these two models you go on. So certainly, I mean, in fact, one of the options could be that you only focus on how you heat your home, because we're basically considering rationing as quite a broad range of policies. So we're not trying to pinpoint one particular one policy of rationing. So it could be that you look at heating your home as one particular thing and be like, let's get people to be more efficient in the home, get them to focus on insulation and so on, and we can do that by rationing your kind of household energy kind of allowance. Right. But as I say, or it could be the more broader carbon allowance that covers everything, but that then might still include your household energy bills. Right. But essentially, any time you pay for something, so basically one way to think about rationing is it's a two-currency system. So anytime you buy something, you need to have enough money and you need to have enough allowance, and that could be a carbon allowance or it could be a specific petrol allowance, depending on what kind of policy you're going for. Okay. But yeah, so I think that idea of a dual currency is a really important way to think about it. You just always need to have enough of both of those currencies if you ever want to buy anything, basically.
Yes, and would you be able to get more of the currency? So if you, like, say, for example, I've got loads of money, but I haven't got much carbon allowance, and you're the other way around, would I be able to buy some of your carbon allowance?
Not on our model. So basically, one part of the paper is comparing rationing as we see it with a policy which others have considered it, which is like the idea of tradable personal carbon allowances, and that's been much more discussed in the academic literature than like straightforward rationing as we see it. And basically, on that model, if you've got loads of money and then you use up all your carbon allowance, and I've got loads of carbon allowance left because I've got no money, so I can't, because it's a dual currency system, so I can't use up my carbon allowance because I'm skint. Yeah. Then on that system, then you could come along and be like, I'll buy some of your carbon allowance off you. And we do kind of see the appeal of that, but we basically want to say that people need to look at rationing without tradability as well. So that's basically the policy that we argue is neglected, this idea of rationing without tradability.
Right, okay. So there has been some attention to the tradable model, but not
so that less so recently, I think, I forget my dates, but maybe 10 or 20 years ago, that was... there was quite a lot of work in that, and I think this is more Nathan's area, so that's why I'm being a little bit fuzzy about the details. But I think Nathan was saying there was a bit of a resurgence in research in that area as well. But the resurgence, again, is very much on the tradability side. Right. So on the rationing side, as we understand rationing, because we don't like to consider these tradable allowances, we don't call them that rationing. Okay. We can talk about that later why, but it's this more straightforward rationing that we argue has basically been neglected in the academic literature. Right,
okay. So are you aware of any academic work that's been done on this as an option? Or?
Yeah, so there's one paper which received a lot of attention quite a while ago in the early 2000s, and that was by a historian called Mark Roodhouse, whose work was on Second World War rationing, his historical research. So he didn't write an academic paper on rationing in relation to climate change, but he wrote a paper in a journal called History and Policy, which is a journal that doesn't publish new original research. It publishes short articles by academics where academics think that they have something to offer to policymakers. So the idea, well, policymakers or journalists, that kind of public-facing kind of people. So he wrote a short, I think it's 2 or 3 page article defending rationing, and that was basically our sort of launch pad, if you like. We took his, so we really like his paper, but I say it's only a couple of pages long, and we just tried to add a bit more detail, add a bit more argument. Obviously, he's a historian, so he's looking about from the historical perspective, whereas I'm an ethicist, so I was looking, okay, what are the ethical arguments to kind of add to this? And Nathan was more focused on making those policy comparisons with the tradable allowance schemes that were already being discussed and that kind of thing.
Okay, so you think this has been neglected as an option? Do you have a kind of idea of why it's been neglected, why people haven't given it much thought?
I guess there's a number of reasons. I think intuitively it's just not attractive to people. I guess people have negative connotations of rationing. I think it's one thing. Certainly I think it's considered old-fashioned. So a few years ago, I'm not sure if I know how to pronounce her name, but the Guardian journalist Sonia Soda wrote an article arguing for rationing. So she was basically saying that she couldn't see herself being persuaded to eat less meat, for example, just voluntarily, but if it was rationed, she would. But the critical thing is that she argued it should be modernised, and so she had this idea of a carbon card. Well, I mean, it's not an original idea, right? That's an existing idea. Yeah. But critically, one of the things that she thought would be done to modernise it was, again, you would introduce a market, you would have tradability.
Right. Okay.
And I guess we live in such a market society now that I think it's very alien to people, the idea that it wouldn't be tradable. And that's one of the main things we get challenged on. It's like, why wouldn't these things be tradable? Surely everyone benefits if in our scenario we described earlier, if I've run out of if I've run out of money but I've got carbon allowance left and you've got plenty of money left but you run out of carbon allowance, don't we both benefit if we trade? Yeah. So I think just people have that mindset and they just can't see the advantage of making it non-tradable, and that's kind of and we want to come in and say you might want to think about why you might want to think about it. One thing to emphasise is, and this might sound odd, we're not like 100% in favour of rationing. We're not presenting rationing as a clear solution. So a couple of nuances we'd want to add is, one, we just think it should be in the conversation. We think it's being neglected. We think it has advantages that people aren't seeing. Whether those advantages are great enough to actually want using it is a further debate, and we don't necessarily go as far to say that we definitely want it, although I possibly do lean in that direction, but we certainly acknowledge that there's further discussion to have. The other qualification I would want to add is we certainly don't think it would be used in isolation. We think it should be used in combination with other policies. So it's not rationing instead of all of the other things that other people are talking about. It's another thing to throw into the mix, basically.
Yeah. That historical perspective is really interesting. It's a really interesting element of this, and I understand you're not the historian on the project, but I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that. So this point about, maybe our mindsets change, so we just expect things to be tradable. Perhaps we're just much more used to a market approach to things being kind of more deeply embedded in society generally, compared to the last time rationing was used, at least in this country on a large scale, which was the Second World War and immediately after the Second World War. So showing my ignorance here, but so ration cards in that period were not tradable, is that right?
Yes. I mean, as lots of people have reminded us, there was a black market, but officially they weren't tradable. And that was basically a deliberate policy. And so one of the things that we say in response to people like Sonia Soda, it's just like, why wouldn't this be tradable, is we argue, based on kind of Josie's historical research, the non-tradability was actually a big part of the appeal. Because again, that's another one of the things that we emphasise, is that people, in fact, I've said it myself just a few minutes ago, people think of rationing as being unattractive, but actually rationing was popular at the time. So you have to distinguish between the scarcity that rationing was a response to and the rationing itself. And it's the scarcity that was unpopular.
Yes, yeah.
So when people celebrated the end of rationing, they weren't really celebrating the end of rationing, they were celebrating the end of the need for rationing.
Yeah.
And actually that's one of the big differences between the Second World War and the current situation as well, is because at the beginning of the Second World War, people actually had direct experience of rationing and knew how good it was because of the First World War. Right. So one of the things that Josie kind of emphasised, and which we then put in the paper, is that rationing was resisted for a long time in the First World War, I guess because it was considered unattractive. But then when people started to realise this isn't working, we need to do something, and rationing was introduced, it was basically an overnight success. So immediately it solved, I won't go as far as saying it solved all the problems, but it was just a uncontroversial success. It just worked. Right. And because before that you had massive queues.
Yeah.
And I guess because people don't know this, probably need to throw in some background information here. So the other thing you need to do is think about the economics of supply and demand, right? So if there's scarcity, then there's much more demand and there's little supply. So if you leave things just to the market, prices go up, and they go up massively. Or at least, if you just leave it to market, obviously you can intervene, you can have price caps and things like that. Yeah. But if you don't intervene, then you just have a system where poor people die because they can't afford to eat, right? So then the next step is like, okay, we can try to introduce price caps so then people can afford the basic necessities. But then if you have a price cap but without rationing, then you get massive queues because you basically have rationing by queuing. The only way you get what you want is you queue for it because price is no longer the thing that's stopping you getting it. So it's just how long you're willing to queue outside the shop. And basically once rationing was brought in, that was all, you didn't have to queue anymore because you know how much you could get. Yeah. So from the very practical side, it just kind of worked.
Okay.
And that's the really important thing is it's not rationing. It's not rationing alone. Rationing is always, I don't know about always, but certainly in the Second World War, rationing was combined with this price cap. Yeah. So things were kept affordable, so even the poorest members of society could afford the basic necessities. And then because of the supply and demand problem, because everyone wants it and it's cheap, so everyone can afford it, you then need the ration to manage the distribution. Right. And one of the things that made rationing popular is that it was perceived as fair. It's like, so people talked about the burden of the war effort. So if you allowed tradable rations, then essentially what you're saying is rich people don't have to carry any of the burden of the war effort. It's like you can carry on living in luxury because you just buy extra rations from the people who don't have enough money to use up their rations, kind of thing. Yeah. So by keeping prices low and then by making them non-tradable, so everyone got the same amount, it was perceived as an equal share of the burden of the war effort, if you see what I mean. Right. And that's one of the key things that we think people are missing when they ask, why wouldn't you want tradability? Because that's the real benefit, right? The fairness of sharing the burden.
So your argument is not just that it would be perceived as fair, but it actually is fairer.
Yeah, so that's an important distinction. That's a distinction that our reviewers were keen to push on us. Okay. And so they are two separate points, right? So is it fair and is it perceived as fair? And I guess we don't go too much into that argument because obviously fairness itself is a huge debate, right? And there's a huge literature on egalitarianism, right? So one thing to say is rationing is essentially an egalitarian approach, right?
Right.
I like to think about egalitarianism in matters of degree, so I think you can be more or less egalitarian. Yes. So I'm not necessarily talking about strict equality, I'm just talking about, you can have some societies that are more egalitarian than others.
Right.
So in those broad terms, it's essentially an egalitarian policy. So if you really wanted to defend what we defend as being a fair principle, you would have to get into that whole debate of egalitarianism versus libertarianism versus so on. So to a large extent, we don't go into that, but we think on a relatively common sense kind of ethics that it's at least plausible to think it's fair.
Yes.
So that's essentially up. So you might think philosophically that's kind of weak, but the paper's already well over 10,000 words, so there's only so much you can do. But it was certainly perceived as fair. I mean, again, this is a generalisation. Presumably that's not universally true. Presumably there are people who rich people in particular, I assume, who might have a different view of fairness. But as a generalisation, and certainly from the reports that Josie found in her archival research, that was what people found, that it was popular because it was perceived to be fair.
Which supports the idea that this is at least a kind of common sense notion of fairness, right? If it was actually widely seen as fair, then that at least suggests that, this is not some weird idea of fairness that you're introducing. It's something that's commonly held. But I was going to ask, I mean, maybe this is going to lead us into exactly the kind of territory that you don't want to get into, but I was wondering, it might not just be rich people who might have a different idea of what's fair there, right? So you could imagine somebody who's less well off, who's got, this ration card, and what you're saying is you're not allowed to trade that for something else. But presumably, if I'm in that position and I want to trade it, then it's in my interest to trade it. And therefore, how can it be more fair towards me if I'm barred from doing that? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So I think one of the key things we'd emphasise is that we do recognise the appeal of tradability. So we're not so against the market with this thing. It's just hard to deny what you've just said, right? So people want to do things. There is a kind of burden of proof on us to say, well, why shouldn't you let people do what they want? In general, we think, with a few exceptions, we think people should be allowed to do what they want, and that's generally in their interest. And as a society, we're generally opposed to paternalism and that kind of thing. So for me, it's all about compromise. There are definitely benefits of having a market. There's no doubt about that. But there are also costs. And one of the things about so to some extent we're influenced by Michael Sandel, who's got a paper called What Money Can't Buy, and we actually don't write a lot about that in the paper. We reference him in passing a couple of times, but in the background he's probably more of an influence than it might seem if you just read the paper. And he talks about, yes, there are all sorts of benefits in having a market in society, but he thinks we've gone too far, and he talks about the difference between having a market in society and being a market society. Right. And he talks about how he thinks there are just some things that intuitively we think just shouldn't be allowed to be sold, and not always for the same reason. But again, he talks about rich people buying a right to pollute. So he doesn't talk a lot about climate change in that book, but he does have a couple of references to climate change. And one of the things he specifically says is this idea of it being problematic to think people can have a right to pollute. Yeah. So if you're rich, you're like, oh yeah, I just buy more carbon allowances, and I don't have to get rid of my Ferrari, and those poor people, whose carbon allowance I'm buying, they can reduce their emissions, whatever. Yeah. Of course, it's, generally the poor people have the lower carbon emissions anyway, so it's more the rich people that we want to be reducing their emissions. But there is a cost to that, So by trying to stop tradability for that kind of reason, it's difficult to do that without having knock-on effects, and so there kind of is a compromise to be made there. And again, in our paper, we're not necessarily saying what the right compromise is. a lot of this paper is about trying to open up new discussions as opposed to being the end of a discussion and saying this is the answer. So there definitely is compromise. One other clarification though is, although we talked about rationing being an egalitarian policy, that doesn't mean that everyone should get a strictly equal ration. Right. And again, this is where it gets complicated, and anyone who is thinking about real life policy would have to think really hard about this. But just to give you one example from the Second World War, so pregnant women got a greater food allowance than women generally because of basically they have a greater need. Right. So it's not, the idea is we don't want to give an equal ration to everyone regardless of their needs. It's more equal rations for comparable needs or relative to needs. Again, it's a lot easier said than done. So to actually do that in practice would involve a lot more than what we talk about in this paper. You'd have to think, okay, what does that mean? How do we decide who gets that little bit more and so on?
But that's the principle.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
It's kind of equity rather than equality. That's one way of putting that, is it? Or is that wrong?
I'm not sure I've ever had a good understanding of that distinction myself. I don't know if I should admit that. I think I'll remain neutral on that. But yeah, definitely. We are definitely not saying that it's just a strictly equal supply of everything to everyone, regardless of situation and so on.
Good. So it seems like that we at least kind of perceive this kind of approach as more fair. And do you think that's something to do with the fact that, well, going back to the Second World War example, what's happening there is there's a kind of social solidarity in everybody, as you say, sharing the burden of the war effort. So it's like there's a collective threat that's being faced. And maybe that's partly why people were more willing to, take on their share, and perhaps more resentful of a situation where people might take on less share, because, when there's that kind of collective effort that's being undergone, people have more of an egalitarian.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So whether it's a war effort or whether it's a kind of a social effort in response to climate change, I think it does make sense to think about it in terms of a burden, right? So there is we need to do something to address climate change. Now, there are some people who, for different reasons, think that we can combat climate change or mitigate climate change without there being any burden for anyone. We don't really get into that debate. And if that turns out to be true, then we certainly wouldn't suggest rationing for the sake of it, right? If we can solve climate change without anyone having to make any sacrifices, bring it on. That's great. But we're assuming that some kind of sacrifice will be necessary. And then if that's the case, then why should rich people be immune from that? That's kind of the thought. And I think that's a common thought. Yeah. And again, Josie has a really nice quote that she found, which was, again, found from her archival research from government papers. And they basically did research and they said people were basically totally unwilling to make any significant voluntary sacrifices, even for the war effort, even when people talk about, the kind of solidarity that people had in the Second World War, despite that, it's like people won't do this voluntarily. Yeah. But if it's a burden that's shared equally across society, people will accept it without undue grumbling, or I can't remember the exact phrase. Yeah. I think it was very much that kind of resentment of rich people being able to, in the case of climate change, being able to buy the right to pollute. And I think, again, it goes back to that Michael Sandel book. It's like, what do we think people should be able to buy? It's like, if you've got a bike, you don't use it anymore, you won't say it to me, I want a new bike, I like your bike. Yeah. That sounds like the sort of thing that we want people to be able to trade, right? That doesn't look like a good candidate for what money can't buy. Yeah. But right to pollute, that looks like a good candidate for something you shouldn't be able to buy. That's kind of the core message, if you like. Yeah.
And I suppose, obviously, there's a kind of more recent parallel, isn't there, which is the pandemic that we've just emerged from. So in that case, again, there was like an external threat which we had to face collectively as a society. And it seems like those kind of intuitions about fairness came out quite strongly there as well, right? So,
I mean, if you think about, I guess it's not natural to think about in this terminology, but if you think about going out as a good, and it's like that was essentially a good that had to be rationed. We couldn't mix socially, so social interaction is a good we had to ration. And if Boris Johnson thinks he was immune from that, we've seen the response.
Exactly.
Right?
I mean, if there had been a policy which said, people are allowed to buy more freedom during the pandemic, if you're able to kind of pay other people to have 2 hours out of your house in the afternoon rather than one or something like that, then those intuitions probably would have kicked in a bit more as well, wouldn't they?
I think, exactly. I think that's right. So it's like if you just said, can't go to pubs anymore, unless you can afford this exclusive club. This club's going to stay open, but it's like £1,000 entry fee or something like that. It's like, there's just no obvious justification for that. It's like so if you put it in terms of why can't we have a market for this, it makes my position sound bad, right? It's like, well, who are you to stop people trading stuff? But if you phrase it in terms of, can you buy the right to pollute, or can you buy the right to socialise more in a pandemic while everyone else is making sacrifices? Like, my position looks a bit less absurd now.
It looks a bit more kind of natural. Good. Okay. So the kind of main ethical reason in favour of the approach that you're discussing in the paper is fairness. Are there any other ethical arguments in favour of it, or is that the...
Let me think. I guess it is primarily fairness. I mean, I guess it depends on how you separate kind of practical advantages versus ethical, because I guess if there are practical advantages, if it will work well, I guess that's an ethical issue as well.
Sure.
But if you treat those kind of practical benefits as different, then I'm trying to think if I've forgotten anything in my paper. I think it is primarily the egalitarian argument.
Okay. So what are the practical advantages that it has?
Well, so one of the things that Mark Roodhouse emphasised in his very early paper was the effectiveness. And actually, that's another thing that I probably should have clarified earlier. So it depends what you're comparing it to, right? But so if you compare it to, for example, a carbon tax, because it's difficult to know what to compare it to, because obviously if you compare rationing versus investing massively in renewable energy, it doesn't look like just look like two very different types of policy. And in fact, from our point of view, they don't look like things that should be alternatives, right? It's like you might want to do both. Yeah. But if you think about it in terms of other policies that you could approach from an individual consumption point of view, then a carbon tax is probably, I'd probably say definitely the most well-discussed alternative. Right? So carbon taxes have been talked about a lot in, not just in academic debate, but in policy debate and in the newspapers. It's like an idea that everyone is aware of. Whether you're for it or against it, it would be hard to think of anyone who's not familiar with the idea, right? Yeah. So if you take a carbon tax as the natural comparison, and that is the comparison that we emphasise in our paper, then Mark Roodhouse argues that rationing would be much quicker than a carbon tax approach. Basically because at least for some time, a lot of people will be able to just bear with the costs. So if you put the tax up a bit, people are like, that's tough, but I'll dig into my savings a bit, or I'll, whatever, and people can make it work. And of course, if you want to avoid that problem by making the tax even greater, then of course you increase the unfairness, or to put it in terms that are less controversial, you certainly increase the impact on the poor. So if you make the tax great enough that it actually has an impact on enough people that it really does reduce the emissions, then you're almost certainly going to be having a massive impact on the poorer parts of society. Right. So again, it's hard to keep the fairness aspect and the practicality aspect separate, but nevertheless, Mark Roodhouse's claim, which we support as well, is that it's just quicker. You bring it in, and as of the day the policy is introduced, you have this much petrol, and you can't go over it. So, of course, there's a question of how strict, or don't know if strict is the right word, how stringent the rationing is, because it could be rationing that actually affects very few people, because maybe only a few people use so much that they'd be affected by it, or it could be a really stringent ration that it's bare minimum, and pretty much everyone is kind of reducing their consumption of whatever it is you're rationing. So, but the speed of it is one of the other significant kind of advantages.
Okay, great. And presumably there are some practical challenges as well that you would anticipate?
Yes, and again, as a philosopher, that's not so much my area, but that's, and it's also, it depends what form of rationing you take, right? So probably the kind of Second World War style rationing, where you ration particular goods, so you ration petrol and you maybe ration flight, and maybe you ration household energy. That's probably relatively straightforward in comparison to the all-encompassing carbon ration kind of thing. And the all-encompassing rationing card, carbon ration card that you might have, a couple of things to say about that. First of all, that's much less my area, that's more Nathan's area. But one thing that is worth saying about that is there's a significant literature on that. So the people who do the tradable personal carbon allowances, the people who defend that kind of approach have, written on this, and so when you talk about practicalities, what we're essentially saying in the paper is do what they say, just take out the tradability. That's one way to think about it.
That's fair enough, because that's not a distinctive challenge for your approach. It's a challenge for any approach.
Yeah, although one thing I would say is certainly me, so this is something me and Nathan talked about quite a lot, and I think Nathan is maybe in the process of changing his mind a little bit, I'm not sure, but certainly previously he was more on that kind of all-encompassing kind of carbon allowance kind of approach, whereas I think I was more in favour of the let's just target specific things and have the simplicity of rationing. And one other thing that's worth saying is I think that Tina Fawcett is one of the main advocates of these tradable allowances, and there's an interview with a guy called Stan Cox who wrote a book on rationing, not solely in terms of climate change, but across a range of different areas. And he interviewed Tina Fawcett, and he quotes Tina Fawcett as saying that no one has worked out a non-tradable kind of rationing scheme. And basically we argue in our paper in response to that is not only has it been worked out, it's actually been tested. We did it. It's the Second World War model. And, lots of the things that we rationed in the Second World War are the same things you'd want to ration now. So petrol and meat being two of the key ones. Yeah.
That's interesting because, I suppose actually in a way it ought to be easier to achieve now because of the technology that's available to us, right? So when the form of rationing was basically ration books, it's going to be difficult to stop people trading those ration books with each other, right? Whereas if you've got a kind of personal card, there ought to be technological solutions to that kind of problem.
Yeah, presumably. Again, that's not so much my area of expertise, but that sounds right, that if you've got a credit card, it wouldn't be a credit card, but a carbon debit card, I guess, then it might be harder to give part of that to someone else. I'm sure people would find a way around that for the black market, I guess.
Yeah, but I suppose one of the things that you're saying is that actually you might not anticipate too much trying to find ways around it because actually people will buy into it, right? So for any kind of scheme like this, you need people to buy into it so that people aren't just constantly trying to circumvent it. And presumably that's kind of what happened in the Second World War, right? There was a black market, but it wasn't enormous, it wasn't all-encompassing.
Exactly, and that's right. So that's that's probably one of our most common objections. Like, this won't work, there'll be a black market.
Yeah.
And our response is, it worked in the Second World War. And yes, there was a black market, but yeah, like you say, it wasn't big enough to upset it. So again, go back to Mark Roodhouse. So he's got a whole book on Second World War rationing. Well, in fact, his book is actually not on the Second World War rationing. His book is actually on the black market. So I mean, that's very much on his area of expertise. And yeah, he basically argues that if anything, the black market was kind of helpful because, I mean, remember what I said a few minutes ago when I said all of this stuff about tradability is a kind of compromise because we do recognise the value of markets.
Yeah.
But what we were saying is that there are practicalities, and so what you might lose some of the benefits of markets in order to get the benefit of the egalitarian approach you wanted. But what Mark Roodhouse says, if I get this right, is essentially the black market actually gave you some of those benefits of the market, but without actually undermining the efficiency and the effectiveness of rationing. So it's almost kind of like, as long as it doesn't get out of hand, it's almost a good thing to have the black market.
That's really interesting, right.
Now, again, that would be something that would be hard to predict exactly how that would translate to a modern system. But yeah, I think you're right. It would depend a huge amount in how much people bought into it.
Yeah.
So if people, and again, you can't talk in generalizations because you can't say everyone would support it. So it would all depend on the numbers, right?
Yeah.
So if the majority of people supported it to the extent that the climate change deniers and those kind of people, if it became almost socially unacceptable for them to be too loud about their climate change denial or whatever, then if there is that majority support for climate change action, then it could work. Of course, if you've got a society that's 90% climate change denial, it's not going to work. But then nothing else is either, right?
Yeah. I suppose that is potentially one area of difference from the Second World War, because it's not like there were, large numbers of people denying that the war was actually happening. But yeah, okay. Well, we're nearly out of time, but I just wanted to ask you before we finish. So, like, quite often as an academic, what you do is you'll write a paper like this and you'll publish it in an academic journal, and then some other academics will read it, but you're basically just talking to each other largely. That's not really been your experience with this paper, is it? So
no, not with this paper. Yeah. So I thought people might be interested in it, so I approached the press office at Leeds, and they basically produced a press release, and I've done it for a paper before and got nothing, so I didn't really know what to expect. I didn't know if anyone would pick it up.
Yeah.
I actually thought The Guardian might pick it up because, as I say, Sonia Sodder had written something on rationing before. As it turned out, I think The Guardian was one of the few papers that didn't pick it up.
Really? Right.
So we had stuff in the Daily Mail where I didn't necessarily expect, although in hindsight maybe I should have expected it, because obviously they liked something to get outraged about. But in the Times, Radio 4, so in fact, and when International wrote, it was on Fox News, and the New Republic, which is an American kind of political journal, I think, which I hadn't heard of either, but I looked it up and it had some very famous writers who had written for it. And that was, they actually probably wrote the best article on it as well. Their article was probably the best article that came out of all of the sort of attention that it was.
That's interesting. So maybe we'll link to that in the show notes for this episode, so people can go and find that for themselves. But I take it, some of those publications you've just listed are probably on the side of the political spectrum where you wouldn't expect them to be sympathetic towards the kind of approach that you're...
Yeah, so I was a little bit surprised with the Daily Mail article because it actually wasn't bad. It was actually, I mean, it largely kind of regurgitated the press release, so it was fairly kind of factual and didn't get outraged. But of course, they left that for Richard Littlejohn to do a couple of days later. But the actual original article was perfectly fine, and just like any of the other articles in any of the other papers, really. So that was kind of a nice surprise. Yeah. Richard Littlejohn was less of a surprise.
And you had Nigel Farage tweeting about you, is that right?
Yeah, so Nathan spotted that. I'm not sure how he spotted it. I hadn't seen that, but Nathan sent it to me, and various people have said to me since that if you're annoying Nigel Farage, you're probably doing something right. So I think, and we got invited to go on GB News, but basically we were advised not to go on, basically because they said they'd just put us up against a climate change denier, and it would just be futile, basically. So
was that the press office that?
Yeah, so basically, we were, for the couple of weeks around the publication, we were in quite sort of constant contact with them, and they were like, Radio 4 interested, do that, and GB News are interested, don't do that. In fact, I wanted to write a response to the Richard Littlejohn piece, actually. I wanted to kind of actually take it seriously, because I had this idea that, there were some stupid things he said, but there were a few things I actually wanted to say, look, I'm not actually that unsympathetic to some of what he's saying, but then to say this is how I'd respond to it.
Right.
And we had a bit of a discussion about whether that was a good idea or not, and in the end we actually kind of came to, it was kind of borderline, it wasn't an easy decision, but we basically decided that it probably wasn't worth the hassle, and may not get that much benefit from it being in that source. But so there's some interesting discussions about what we should respond to and what we shouldn't, kind of in terms of what would be beneficial and just what would be worth the annoyance and the pain. And we got loads of really rude remarks, and so Richard Littlejohn said something like, they're not scientists. Actually, that wasn't him, that was a comment, but he said, talking about me, he said, he's a lecturer in interdisciplinary ethics, whatever that is. It's I'm like, it's not that complicated. I'm a lecturer, you know what that is. Ethics, maybe doesn't know what that is. And then interdisciplinary, it's all pretty self-explanatory. and it's not a science paper. We don't claim to be making any claims about the climate science. We take fairly conservative's not the right word, but fairly uncontroversial starting points, things like the IPCC. Well, they say we need to reduce our fossil fuels. How do we reduce our fossil fuels? But we're not climate scientists. We never claimed to be. That was a really common comment. These people aren't even scientists. Like, why would scientists know about rationing?
That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. But were there any kind of specific criticisms or comments that you got that you think are worth taking seriously and worth responding to?
Yeah. So one of my favourite in the sense that it gives me a chance to clarify something was a quite common comment that our approach was the wrong approach, and we should be looking for technological innovation. And this is a step backwards to going back to rationing. That's crazy. We should be thinking about in this modern age, we should be thinking about innovation and solving it that way. And two things we'd say about that is certainly, if we'd invested in green energy 40 years ago and we're at a point where we just didn't need fossil fuels anymore now, then absolutely we wouldn't even be talking about rationing now. So it's not that we want rationing for the sake of it, right? It's we're in an urgent situation, and as Mark Roodhouse says, it's something that we can do very quickly. But the main point I want to emphasize in relation to that is rationing can drive innovation, and it drives it in a particular direction, right? So necessity is the mother of invention. So if we've got one technology that we're using a lot of, and if you say, right, don't use that anymore, that forces us to innovate in a different direction. So if the argument is, look, the solution is the innovation of green energy, well, ration the non-green energy and you will force the innovation in that direction.
Yeah, that seems right, doesn't it? So you can imagine, if you've got a situation where one company's product has a certain amount of, carbon allowance attached to it, and another company's has a different amount, then that company's product is going to be more popular, and therefore that's an incentive for them to innovate in a way to drive down.
Yeah, and that's a good way to think about it. So think about the whole dual currency thing, right? So if you've got two products, and let's say they're the same, more or less, but one is half the price of the other in terms of pounds. Then of course people typically buy the cheap one. People might buy the more expensive one because they think it would be better. But if it's established that the quality is the same, people will buy the one that's better better value for money. But when you've got a dual currency system, you have the same thing with your carbon allowance, right?
Yeah.
So you've got two products. This one only uses 10% of my carbon allowance. The other one uses up 30% of my carbon allowance. Which one am I going to buy? So yeah, it's it just works the same as money. You have this. You start thinking the same. What's good value for money? What's good value for my carbon allowance, or that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's another way in which you can argue that your approach isn't anti-market, right? It's an intervention which actually might draw on the virtues of the market in certain ways.
Yes and no. I guess we do have to explicitly say we are anti-market in terms of the specific market of rations. But yeah, in the point you're making, it's absolutely. You're I wanted to say manipulating, but obviously that's not got the connotations I want. But you're having an influence on the market. You're using the market to influence people's choices
in a positive way.
Yeah, in terms of they budget for their carbon allowance just in the way that we budget for our financial, how much money we've got. So yeah.
Great. Okay, well, that's all we've got time for. Just to say thank you very much, Rob Lawlor, for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.